Hello everyone and welcome back to Heart of the Matter with me, Stephen Chia. Now recently, Law and Home Affairs Minister K. Shanmugam put out a detailed ministerial statement in Parliament. It had to do with a young police officer who took his life, but before that, he had accused his colleagues and superiors of racist behaviour. Now, while the case was complex and not all the allegations were true, Mr. Shanmugam said that casual racism allegations will be investigated as disciplinary breaches in the Singapore police force. So today we want to unpack this a little bit more. What exactly is casual racism? Is it clear-cut in the workplace? Are there differences in perceptions, especially among different generations? Okay, let me get a quick take from everyone first. When I say the term casual racism, how do you define it? What comes to mind? Aamir?
Simple things that people might thoughtlessly say, but have quite severe repercussions.
Okay. Jerviel?
I guess it's more stereotypical judgments, but you say in sometimes informal settings and you can't really tell if that's in ill intention or not, or meant as a joke.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Mathews?
Yeah, it's really speech and behavior that conveys negative stereotypes, prejudices. You pick up certain kind of cultural differences, whether it's people's dress or style of doing something, and then of course you kind of poke fun at it, and often in subtle ways, not very explicit in your face, but the undertone is clearly there, and clearly the recipient recognizes it.
So it's almost like you say something about someone because of their race. It could be a joke. You may not be ill-meaning, but they feel offended by it.
Yes.
So that's casual racism.
There may not be malicious intent, but ultimately it's the recipient who then has to recognize or feel the sense that somehow or another his identity as perhaps a minority person has been accentuated in a particular way which is negative.
Sometimes when we travel overseas and we say we're from Singapore, and then they look at us, you're Indian, you're Chinese, and then they say, oh, but you speak so well. So if I take offense at that, I can say that's racist. Is that fair? Or am I just being too sensitive?
I think it might be the ignorance of the other person not knowing that Singapore is an English-speaking country. So that may not necessarily pertain to a race, because that generally happens to everyone.
Well, what if I didn't say I was from Singapore? I just show up and he says, wow, you're Chinese and you speak really well.
Yeah, so then I would assume that because he identifies you as Chinese, that would be some form of racism.
I guess it really depends on the context. Some people maybe just don't know, you've not been exposed to that. That's one thing. But then I guess if you put that same context, you're in Singapore. If someone makes that statement, for instance, and knowing that everybody goes through English education, and then you pick up one particular group as not being able to or insidiously say that one group doesn't speak the language properly, I mean, that would probably be seen as racism.
So it sounds like it has to do with the environment we are in as well, because to put things into context, then we can say whether that might seem right or wrong. Is that a fair statement?
It is. It's very contextual, and it's really the community of recipients who ultimately arbiter this.
Okay, so let's talk about how different generations perceive this then. Aamir, in a chat with our producer, you had said that your generation is deculturalized. So you and your friends don't see each other, through that racial lens. Is that what you mean?
I think from my own interactions, I've seen the older generation, their identity is centered around their culture, their language, less so with the younger generation, where there is this sort of homogenized Singaporean identity, and then after that, it's the other elements of whether it's race, religion, culture, or even belonging to a minority status. So the emphasis of the identity is slightly different, I think.
So would you say that younger people are less racist?
No, I think the thing about racism, I think, is just ignorance and sometimes intolerance. And I think that carries through every generation but comes out in different ways. So I'll give you an example. My parents' generation, there used to be this common thing where if you see a Punjabi person, you'd pinch the person and then you ask what color. Now, that wouldn't be found in my generation at all. But my generation may have internalized some of the stereotypes and then perpetuate them when they have certain interactions.
So that can be difficult because, again, you learn from your parents and that lens decides what is right or wrong for you. I always remember the example where in the past, people used to say, oh, if you are a naughty girl, one day the Indian man will come and take you away. Right? So that was obviously from a Chinese person saying it, right? And that is very clearly racism.
Yeah. But I've actually an incident, exactly the same thing. It was this coincidental day in the morning, I heard a Chinese lady scold her child, and she's like, "Oh, the Bangala man will come and find you," right? And I was like, "Okay, my gosh, that's a lot." That very afternoon, I was at religious class, and then one of my aunts was scolding her child and said, "If you don't behave properly, Mr. Tan will come and get you." And I was like, "Okay, at least there's some sort of balance," but still, that using of an individual from another race to strike fear into children's heart, that was quite an interesting moment.
Yeah, so let's consider that in a work setting today. Again, Singapore is very multiracial. We all work with colleagues from many different races. How do we then define what is okay and what is not okay? Especially if you think about it from an HR perspective, like Jerviel in your company. If someone comes to you and says, "Oh, I'm upset, this person said this thing about me," and how do you decide whether, if it's one of those in the grey areas of whether it's really racism or not?
I think we have to look at whether there's a pattern, right? Sometimes we take one incident and say, "Oh gosh, this is a full-on racist remark," and then we make a mountain of the molehill. So when and if colleagues come to me like this, I'll always tend to ask, like, what was the setting, what's the context, and more importantly, it's actually giving what I call make the most generous assumption that probably that person didn't know that it wasn't funny. A lot of times what I tell my colleagues is, just because you think it's funny, it's probably not so in other person's eyes. And you need to understand that this is a professional work setting. There are just certain things that you don't talk about it, right? But I think more importantly is I've always been advocating to empower people on the ground to actually flag these things and actually approach these conversations on their own instead of escalating to HR. Because by the time when you reaches HR, it's probably all too late.
Right.
So helping our colleagues to know how to approach this conversation respectfully, that will actually tackle the casual racism. Because the reason why it's called casual is because it's happening anytime where probably HR is not there to police all the pantry conversations, nor the managers themselves. So the colleagues themselves need to be equipped with the capabilities and the competencies to approach all these tough conversations.
But in the first place, do they even know what is considered racism? At which point does it cross the line? Do you need companies to then create some kind of a HR policy? You say, okay, these are the things you can say, these are things you cannot say.
I think it all starts with some amount of training, which I think companies should have or should do to help people to become a little bit more sensitive that the words we say can carry some kind of effect, and we have to be accountable, responsible for the words we say. If there are words we say which in some way or another strike a certain tone to a potential recipient, that they're being undermined, they're being judged based on their color, their ethnic background, then you should think twice about it. Some of those general understanding and training needs to be in companies so that people can better navigate that. Then after that, of course, it's you using that set of principles and applying it to different contexts and seeing whether that's problematic. Ultimately, as I think Jerviel mentioned, it's really about individuals within the setting standing up and saying, John, maybe that's not a really appropriate thing to say to Ismail. So some of that, I guess, will be when people use those principles and they look at specific issues.
But it's still so hard to really define it because it's so grey. There's so many, Okay, so I'm a foreigner. I don't speak Mandarin. I go out with my Chinese colleagues at lunch. They all speak Chinese. I don't understand what's going on. I feel a bit left out. I can go and complain to my HR and say, hey, I felt offended by that.
I mean, you could feel offended or, that probably stemmed from that feeling of you're feeling left out. But they probably didn't mean it as purposely trying to ostracize you or sideline you. They do not know how to also include you in those conversations as well. So yes, you can raise this up to HR, and I think HR would then need to educate everyone about this, inclusiveness, right? And how do we handle people or include people into this kind of work settings or work conversations, which I agree with the doctor, which is you need to really educate people. But the thing is, there is no 101, rules or definitions on what those remarks or those actual behaviors look like. Policies have to evolve over time. I think a lot of time HR just set this policy and doesn't change for 10 years. But, with social media right now that proliferate certain remarks and whatnot, I think HR policies also need to refine themselves over time.
But then there'll be so many areas that HR will be having to, because every day it could be a new thing. Because, people in a way are unaware. They don't have ill intent. It just comes about. And if somebody complains, then it becomes an HR issue. So at which point do you draw a line and say, otherwise everything is like, and what if you are like super sensitive? Everything I say, you feel like, how can he say that? What do you think, Aamir?
Well, I think for a lot of people who experience casual racism, very few, I think, actually voice out. And speaking from personal experience, sometimes you just take it on the chin or you laugh it off. And it's also part of the thing, as Dr. Mathews said, it's you believe that the other person did not mean you any malice. It was out of ignorance.
Right.
And I think racism is kind of on a spectrum as well. So there can be very overt, malicious, intended racism, and there can be unintentional. That again is born out of ignorance.
Right, but this unintentional is the casual racism. I'm not ill-meaning, so does that make it okay?
So I'll give you an example. I remember in BMT, randomly a buddy came up to me and he said, "Oh, you don't smell like an Indian," and I was like, "Okay, should I be insulted? Is this a compliment?" And so, I mean, I honestly didn't know what to do with the statement. I didn't want to raise it to my superiors. Not really the point, but it really reflected, I think, his worldview, and it was not for me to educate this person. If the person's ignorant, and I think also if the space is conducive, you could have a constructive conversation. But sometimes it's easier just to let it go, simply because you're also so caught up in the moment that you don't know, should I raise this? Am I allowed to raise this?
It also depends on who says it to you, right? So if let's say we're good friends and I say, "Hey bro, you just go and open a mama shop lah." Right? So you will not feel offended by that because of the relationship with her. But if someone else has said that to you, you might take offense with it, right?
I think this is sort of related. I can relate another story. I have a close family friend who point blank said that he doesn't hire minorities. And now we're both from minorities, and I was like, what do you mean? So I actively tried to understand, and his one response was, "Oh, I've been burned before." So when sometimes it's so ingrained, even if the person is your family member or a close friend, it still is racism. And I still couldn't try to figure out how to convince someone with this kind of lived experience that he was wrong. So even though sometimes it could be a close relation, it can still veer into topics that are uncomfortable and I think just a bit more extreme.
So it's almost like, it sounds like we need to, again, know the context, where we are at, who we are with, the environment that we're in, and then know how we should behave in those circumstances. A bit of EQ, so to speak, right? Which for some reason many of us seem to lack. Because that you cannot prescribe, because what may be okay here in this room in Singapore is not okay in Ang Mo Kio in Singapore, right?
Increasingly, though, I think that level of, I won't say sophisticatedness, but there's a sensing that when we heard different instances mentioned here, all of us would, quickly kind of say, well, that really is racism. And if you look at many of the examples, I think we have had polls on that, and as at least 3/4 of Singaporeans who pretty much agree on many of the issues which are commonly seen as racist, whether it's, the typical kind of statement that kind of points out somebody's race and either magnifies that particular stereotype. People recognize that as problematic. They even recognize it as problematic today, even when you do it among friends. People are increasingly becoming more sensitive about that. So I think there's a certain level that comes with broad level education. We do sense that, but it's true. It's very, very hard to always, for every situation, be able to make that fine delineating line. But the general principles will probably apply.
And I almost feel that, will it become too complicated? Because we are such good friends, I feel like I can speak to you in a way that, you won't take offense. But then I guess it blurs the line because I may forget and speak to another person of that same race in the same way. Is that what we're concerned about?
It is, and I think increasingly, we should all be a little bit more empowered to help people that were close to us know that there might be some ramifications. Maybe I don't feel this so bad when you said that, but I know quite a few of my friends would feel like that. So being able to communicate that would be important, because I think you want to prevent people who are close to you from doing something which would really offend and belittle someone else.
And I think there's also a danger if they do it around you, they give them permission to go and do it before other people and say, "Hey, wait, but my friend wasn't offended, ma." So that's also, I think, part of the need to not necessarily call it out, but have that conversation that what you said might be funny to you, but may not be funny to everybody else.
It's really about understanding everyone's boundaries, and I think we do not have enough conversations around setting clear boundaries. Sometimes we feel that if someone set clear boundaries with me, this person is too sensitive or not. But I believe that being clear about your boundaries is being kind, right? So that's how you become good friends, because you probably started off with
teasing,
bad jokes and whatnot, and then realize over time that this is your boundaries. And I think at workplace, everyone needs to be very mindful of each other's boundaries as well.
Yeah, some time back we went through this diversity training here at MediaCorp, wanting to help people have a better awareness of what people might take offense with. And one example raised was, someone asked me, "My boss likes to swear a lot, but it makes me very uncomfortable." He's not swearing at me, but he just likes to, use that kind of language. So is that okay? And how can I address it? So again, it was one of those where the advice was basically, let your boss know. yet you're uncomfortable. So because if no one tells him, he does not know that, what he's doing has sort of is making people uncomfortable. So it almost sounds a little bit similar in that sense. Let's come back to the example we gave earlier about the Singapore police force. If there had been disciplinary action taken against the officers, would that have sent a signal that it's totally not acceptable? And then does that mean we would start putting down lines as to what is okay, what is not okay? How do you think we could address something like that? Mathews?
Well, it clearly will make it unquestionable that an organization does not stand for that kind of behavior, because I guess in different organizations, casual racism has been just part of the cause. It's just been common. Minorities don't complain; they take it on the chin often. And so, elevating that, telling people that, hey, these issues would be something that. If you feel that you have been negatively or casual racism has been leveled against you, you can go ahead and speak up. Let people know about that. I think that changes the tone of the organization in terms of how they handle that matter. Will people become extremely concerned? They'll be very, very sensitive. They'll always be on the edge with each other. Probably at the beginning, that'll probably be the case. There will need to be some education about this. But over time, I think people will be conscious about the general issues and general areas that they need to be careful about. And apart from that, I think life will go on.
Do you think we need to do that? I think casual racism in that sense is quite rampant in our society, actually, because we often do tease our friends and joke with them, quite often with racist remarks, and many of us don't think twice about it. But if somebody one day said, hey, that hurt me, I'm sure if I said that, I'd be like, oh, sorry, man, I didn't realize that. So where do you think we go from here? Because Singapore is such a multiracial society. I mean, do we want to have such clear boundaries of what you can and cannot do? Does it also take away some of the intimacy we have? Because I feel you're my bro. I mean, I always think of one example in a movie where two little kids, one was a black kid and one was a white kid, and they put their hands together, and one kid had really small hands on top of his. They said, do you see the difference? And he said, yeah, my hand is smaller than yours. That was all he saw.
Yeah. I think you don't need the state to police your intimate relations. And I think as greater awareness comes, individuals themselves will work it out. I think we've seen great progress in terms of how women are treated in the workplace. Gone are the days where certain acts would be tolerable simply because there were difficult conversations to be had and there was progress. So we don't need necessarily more laws. I think there should be regulations in place to protect people, especially in the workplace, but not necessarily in a sort of social setting. I don't think a citizen should be able to say, Mr. Chia said this to me and I'm very offended. Can you please take action? I don't think that's a fair way to live in a society, because then, as Dr. Mathews said, everybody on edge. So it's really within that group. How do you deal with it? If you're mature enough to have the conversation, if the friendship is close enough, then I think you could have that conversation.
I agree with that. I don't believe we can lay out every single law and try to catch everyone. I mean, we do not want the extreme side which becomes where we just cancel each other. Oh, you said something racist, so I'm going to cancel you. You're not going to be my friend, etc. So, but I think you have to take into context. So I think in workplace, because relationships are professional, we are not all your colleagues are your best friends, right? So you have to understand how to then operate professionally in the workplace setting, at the very least.
Okay. So legislation, not the way to go. You guys agree? You shouldn't have laws saying you cannot, say this, or you cannot, or even company policies saying you are not allowed to use these words when speaking to colleagues of this race and things like that.
Well, some days I do believe there's a place for law. I mean, of course, when we talk about law, we talk about penalty, and we talk about going to the fine details of some of that. But we do still need to elevate the issue. I feel companies should have policies to say that, be careful about, racist statements, casual racism is not tolerated in our workplace. Now, exactly what the definition about that is going to be community standards, right? At the end of the day, I guess it's going to be the community consensus of whether some things are really considered racist or not. But I think if you have that general guideline and people know that there are potential actions that can be taken, I don't think people get a little careful. They at least want to find out and study and not act ignorant about every single issue. In that sense, I do think you'll get a certain commitment towards building a more inclusive space.
Right. So that level of education and awareness will help all of us, in fact, because we all level up, so to speak, and sort of interact with each other in a different way. I mean, it's one of those where Yeah, it's still very much a grey area, but based on where you are, where you live, your environment, all those things will put into context the way you should be relating to each other. But I guess we should do it more carefully. Any last thoughts on this? Any last thoughts on this issue that you'd like to share with us?
I think at the workplace level, I mentioned, I think empowering our colleagues and our staff on the ground to be able to have this conversation on their own is very important, right? Because again, everybody's boundaries are different, right? A lot of times we tend to think about people should hold space for me, but we forgot that, we should also hold space for others. Meaning to say, we want people to respect us, right? Not to make any racist remarks against us, but sometimes we also forget that we should also not do it in return. And one very important thing also is that workplace is a professional setting. I think a lot of people forget about that. Like they come into workplace and this whole thing about, be myself, this is an open communication workplace and whatnot. But no, this is work, right?
Aamir, anything like that?
I think I would simply say to the listeners who have been offended, I get it. Most of us have been there. And to the offender, I hope that eventually you have an honest conversation with either yourself or someone that you trust, and you try and figure out what exactly is your prejudice. Was it born out of a mistake? Was it born out of bad interaction? But I have faith. I think growing up in Singapore, I don't feel unsafe. I think Singapore is quite a welcoming, kind country, and a majority of people treat me fairly and respectfully. So it's not a case where every single day I'll have a racist interaction. There are one or a few, but life goes on kind of thing. So it's not, to those who haven't experienced racism, don't assume that racism is everywhere, but it is more apparent than you realize. Yeah.
And I had the vantage point of doing some of this training at companies, something that we have been doing in the last year. And it's very interesting when we have those conversations, when we get people in groups and talking about some of the experiences, people are just kind of aghast that perhaps some of the things that they've said really were very, very demeaning to somebody else within their team. So I would say it's really... I think this is an exploration, it's a growth that people have, and I think we should be open to that growth and recognizing that perhaps there might have been blind spots and perhaps some of the things, the ways we have interacted with our colleagues may really have conveyed something to them which was less than who they really are as an individual.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing, evolving learning journey on that note. Well, thanks so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us. Those of you listening in as well, if you have any thoughts on this, do drop us a note. We'd love to hear from you. Of course, you can catch us on Spotify, on YouTube, all the good places where you get your podcasts. And my thanks to the CNA podcast team, Saya Win, Tiffany Ang, Junaini Johari, Joanne Chan, and Crispina Robert. Our sound designer is Ken Delbridge, and I'm Stephen Chia saying bye for now.